What I wanted to do today are a couple of different things, give you a little sense of scientific integrity at EPA, talk about the 2021 presidential memorandum that is the impetus for all of our work, talk about our new policy, and then really help you to understand your roles and responsibilities in all this. So I will try to do that very quickly. Our program at EPA does basically three things. We write and oversee various policies. We do outreach and communication and training critical to enhancing our culture of scientific integrity. And we hear concerns, give advice, and when necessary, actually adjudicate allegations of losses of scientific integrity. We've been doing this since the policy came into effect, our first policy in 2012. We had a little celebration of 10 years in obviously 2022, but we've really focused on the awareness and visibility because truly the culture at EPA is what sustains us as the world changes around us, but we've really worked hard on that. And we recently did a survey of the agency, and 91% of our respondents, told us that they were familiar with the policy. So that's a really great basis from which to work. The other really exciting thing that, we currently have is we actually have scientific integrity in our strategic plan. So we have a system set up where our deputy scientific integrity officials, and I'll explain who they are in a minute, are doing various actions to implement making scientific integrity more visible, embracing and modeling scientific integrity, and creating robust mechanisms to protect and maintain our culture. So that's keeping everyone pretty busy. But to go back briefly to the memo from 2021, the memo came into effect. I was appointed as one of the co-chairs of the Scientific Integrity Task Force. We worked across agencies with we had about 80 people on this particular committee. And we came up with a report which was backward looking. So, we didn't want to just start over de novo, because you may remember at the beginning of the Obama administration, there were Holdren memos and other scientific integrity documents. So we went back and looked at 10 years, pulled that together into a report, which I highly recommend, and again, on OSTP's website. But that isn't where we stopped. We then created a document where we looked forward. We looked at a framework for actually protecting scientific integrity in agencies. That framework, part of it created a National Science and Technology Council subcommittee on scientific integrity, which I co-chair. And that subcommittee is meant to be the long-term presence for scientific integrity under the National Science and Technology Council. That subcommittee has a variety of work groups. Those work groups actually took all the federal scientific integrity policies, the revised ones. We now have about 28 that we will be finalizing, which is really exciting that 28 agencies have great policies. And actually had, criteria and metrics, graded them, handed them back, and agencies are now in the process of finalizing and posting. So this is the framework. The framework also gave us a new federal definition of scientific integrity, and it gave us a model policy, which many agencies used to draft their policies, including EPA. But this is actually very exciting, more exciting than it seems. We now have one federal definition of scientific integrity. So no matter which agency, and EPA interacts with many agencies, we're on the same page. And basically, we define it as the adherence to professional practices, ethical behavior, and the principles of honesty and objectivity when conducting, managing, using the results of, and communicating about science and scientific activities. And of course, inclusivity, transparency, and protection from inappropriate influence are hallmarks of scientific integrity. But I do want to emphasize one piece of this. We're familiar, I think, all of us, with research misconduct and the research aspects of science. But scientific integrity is a broader umbrella term, which not only includes those pieces, but it also includes when we supervise, communicate, and use science in decision-making. So it's a very broad concept. So what does it look like when we have a loss of scientific integrity? This is by no means a comprehensive list. It is illustrative, not exhaustive. But we're talking about political interference and inappropriate influence on science without scientific justification. Now, there could be influence by political appointees on science, but only if it has the appropriate scientific justification. I'm going to be clear on that. So it's things like manipulation, mischaracterization, suppression, delay, and flawed scientific practice. I think there have been many examples in the news that you're all probably familiar with. We did a lot of things with this update, as the memo, the presidential memorandum asked us to. We did some overarching things. We've got, more, terms and conditions for our grants. We have actually a regulation that it makes our policy extend to contractors and so on. But the key things that we really looked at were the things that were brought up to us by the presidential memorandum to look at, which we hadn't before. We hadn't really focused or thought about scientific integrity and historically underrepresented groups. We hadn't thought about it in terms of the equitable delivery of the federal government's programs. We expanded a lot on our engagement of scientists with the media, emerging technologies, AI and so on, evolving scientific practices such as community science and tribal ecological knowledge, indigenous knowledge, ongoing reporting to OSTP, and ongoing assessment and evaluation. So this is the outline of what our policy looks like. What's new is the definition of scientific integrity and the designation of a role of a chief scientist, which is an all-agency, across-agency position to weigh in on scientific matters. We now have definitions in our policy. We didn't before. We have 32 terms defined, which is really helpful when you're trying to communicate, because people now know, okay, this is what we mean. We are including a code of scientific conduct that we will be drafting, which is basically an I shall document. Policies, it's 29 pages long. It's a you shall document, but we will have this other one page or maybe 2-page document that will really be, okay, I work at EPA, I'm a scientist, here's what I will do, or even if you're not a scientist. The other part of the policy requirements that we really expanded was the reviewing science, and I'll talk quite a bit about that. We also included a really big section on roles and responsibilities. Again, we wanted to be very clear on our expectations of everyone and their roles in scientific integrity. And as I said, more information on monitoring and evaluation. What's not new, though, and I just want to emphasize these things, these were in our last policy, these are in our current policy, are prohibitions on inappropriate influence and political interference, such as delay, suppression, and so on. We touched on those, but also that we must absolutely design and implement our scientific activities such they are independent of any predetermined outcome. We wanted to continue to ensure the right of last review, which basically means if we take science from one scientist, use it in a different context or document, we go back to that original scientist to say, hey, did we get it right? Did we capture it? And again, very easy to miss a nuance. Personal views exception means that you can take off your government hat and speak as a private citizen. This involves a lot of ethics concerns and doesn't mean you can't do it or shouldn't do it, but we really counsel people to work with their ethics officials to make sure they don't step into misuse of position or other ethics rules, potholes that are very easy to trip over. And we have our Scientific Integrity Committee, which is not new. These are phenomenal senior level folks from across the agency, each program office and region. Tom Brennan is our one of our representatives from the administrator's office, so he would be technically your deputy scientific integrity official. These are amazing folks who work with us to make sure that we implement the policy consistently across the agency. So I just want to touch on a few pieces of the various core policy provisions. So starting with protecting scientific processes, we want there to be timelines for science. We're now asking for timelines for scientific products that really allow us the time to do the work, that ensure the accuracy, completeness, and quality of that science. We have now really broadened it. I mean, in our minds, it always included economics and cost-benefit analysis, but now that is explicit in the policy that those things are covered under our scientific integrity policy. Again, I mentioned participatory science, community-engaged research, and language on AI. In addition, and you got a good introduction to this from Tom, our designated federal official at the beginning of this meeting, on conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest. We also have some new language in there about requesting scientific data and full documentation from registrants, permittees, co-regulators, and other sources. Can't make a good decision if you don't have the information that you need. Consultations and collaborations with tribal nations. We have some work language in there. and language on dual-use research of concern. Now, this is the section that we really broadened. Originally in the Holdren memos, and I'll get to some of that, this was really about federal advisory committees. But EPA does huge quantities of internal peer review, external peer review, and interagency review that are not under the auspices of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. So we really broadened it out to include basic review concerns. So some of those are language that make sure that we have charge questions that do not inappropriately limit the scope of the review. Science that informs EPA decision-making is peer-reviewed. We don't want to be basing our decisions or informing our decisions with science that is draft. We also have that comments that are made during interagency review are in writing and in the public domain. One of the things that may be coming through to you in all this is the importance of transparency as an anecdote or vaccine, if you will, for scientific interference in science, right? Transparencies are really our strongest weapon that we have in this challenge. Also that EPA retains the pen in responding to external peer review and early consultation on cross-agency products so that we really have the time for that sufficient review. Again, with federal, this is the section on federal advisory committees. Some of that this is old school, but just to be clear, advisory committee members are subject to the scientific integrity policy, especially you as SGEs, and I think all of you are SGEs, but even those of, if there are any that aren't special government employees, you are expected to uphold scientific integrity as described in the scientific integrity policy. We are required to ensure that the advice of all advisory committees is not inappropriately influenced by agency employees or outside interests and remains independent. And I think you all know that's at the core of what you provide for us is that independence, which is very key. None of this has really changed. I think EPA has had a really great track record on transparent recruitment with public recommendations, widely available biographical information about you all, selection that's based on your expertise, on balance, and consideration of conflicts of interest. Members of technical boards at EPA are largely appointed as special government employees. And when we do make conflict of interest waivers, which we really don't, I mean, I've never seen one, I have to say, but that those would be publicly available on the website so everyone would be clear and know that. Again, I think as you fully know, reports, recommendations, products developed by you all are yours, right? They aren't an agency finding, as it were. They are the findings of this committee. Now, a number of years ago, there was some confusion about your ability as special government employees to communicate with the press, with the media. So we want to make sure that you understand that you are absolutely able to freely express your right, your personal views, but you have to be very clear that you are not speaking on behalf of or as a representative of the agency, but rather in your personal capacity. So we're not taking away your First Amendment rights at all. But there are some constraints when we are talking about certain aspects of your work. So the policy notes that we are expected to be available, right, to answer inquiries from the news media regarding our work, and that extends to you as SGE members of advisory committees. But there is the proviso that to protect the integrity of the advisory process, that you should not be discussing this work during the deliberative phase when you're still actively developing your advice for the agency. But that doesn't extend to forever, right? You are free to respond to inquiries from the press in your capacity as a private citizen, but not in the specific concerns of, concerning the specifics of deliberations. And you should not represent your individual view as the view of the committee, panel, or group that you're participating in, or as those of the agency. Often what happens, and Dr. Jones, I'm sure that you're probably doing this, that you're designated as the spokesperson for the advisory committee, both during the active phase of the project and when the advice has been finalized. So that's all old. That has always been, the case and part of our policy. Moving on, though, to the second section of the policy, very quickly, we have a lot more information about public access, about our elevation policy, about communication of science to the media and congressional testimony. But for the first time, we're actually including in our scientific integrity policy specific abilities for scientists to use social media, which, is such a key tool for us right now. The next section is about supporting the decision-making processes. We have, as I've already mentioned, we've placed limitations on the use of draft science. We've increased transparency. We have an internal rulemaking process called the action development process. We have some language in the policy about that. And we really are encouraging participation by scientists in internal policy discussions. We feel like it's really key to have that scientific expertise in the room directly. We have a section on ensuring accountability. So we have the establishment of administrative consequences when we do substantiate an allegation. That is not my job as the scientific integrity official. All the folks who are on the committee are senior managers at the agency. This goes to them, and then they work with our labor employee relations group, our human resources arm, to really establish and carry out any administrative consequences when something is substantiated. We have had an advice lane, which is an informal lane where folks can come to us early and say, is this scientific integrity? Is something wrong here? It's been really, really important for folks to be able to get early information and early help with concerns that they may have. And a lot of these we settle, if you will, out of court, right? These are things that we say, did you actually ask your supervisor what they were doing here? Did you, there's a lot of facilitation and counseling that goes into this lane, but there's also some other things, and those things get moved into our allegation lane. But none of that was actually in our scientific integrity policy. It was a practice. So now it is in the policy. We also want to make sure that our folks feel free to speak need to with the Office of the Inspector General, with the Government Accountability Office, which is Congress's arm, and other oversight bodies. So that's explicitly in the policy now. We also have additional clarity around protections for when you report a concern or if you express a differing scientific opinion, which is a very, very important part of science. And we have some protections around that we allude to about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. So all that is to say that I think the key things for all of you are consult us early. If you see something, say something, ask a question, reach out. We are easily available to have an early conversation with you about anything. As I've said, transparency is our strongest tool in all of this. So any transparency that you can give is always a good thing. We have a very extensive website where you will be able to find the new policy when it's posted. It's not quite done. We just finished our very extensive public and internal comment periods this month. I can still say that. It's February 29th. And we will be incorporating those comments, doing our last reviews of the policy and getting it posted as quickly as we can. And also, as I've mentioned, good science and good decisions thrive when differing scientific opinions are a normal, necessary, and legitimate part of the process, a really key point for us. Again, when you come to us, you may come in the advice lane, we may move something into the allegation lane, but that is a part of our conversation, and we don't move things without asking you first to make sure that everybody's on board with that, because it becomes a more formal process in the allegation lane. Last but not least, we are here, those deputy scientific integrity officials. For you, it's Tom Brennan. He's great. He knows this stuff. I highly recommend that you reach out to him if you have concerns. But we also do have an Inspector General hotline, which is available to you all, both as private citizens and as members of the Federal Advisory Committee. And also, obviously, I'm available. Last but not least, we really want to ensure that EPA science is high quality and independent, very consistent, I think, with the charter of this committee, that the EPA conveys what science says and performs work in a manner that's in keeping with scientific integrity policy, regardless of internal and external pressures. We are, after all, the EPA. We have external pressures. We always will have them. What we do is at the core of so many economic activities and other things that we're always going to be, in the public eye and visible. So we have to learn to be really good at handling that. And that scientific conclusions are independent of policy or other implications. The policy is what we do about the science or do with the science, right? And that is quite separate, quite different from the science itself. And we have to bear that in mind. So in conclusion, my mantra, scientific integrity is everyone's responsibility, and you are included in that everyone. And I think I left myself some time for questions. I will unshare and be happy to answer any.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. I actually learned a lot, and I was not aware of all these updates. So thank you for presenting them to us. And I would like to give the committee, the board, a chance to ask questions. I am monitoring for hands. If anyone has a question, please feel free to raise your hand. But I will say your presentation was so comprehensive. I had a couple questions I was jotting down, and I think you answered all of them by the time
Great.
so thank you.
Thank you.
We do have a question, Dr. Wolf.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Griffo. Really excellent to see that. And as a former EPA employee, I'm really gratified to see the advance in this. I do have I do wonder, as the vagaries of different administrations come in and out of the government, how are you planning to make sure that this just becomes normal ways of working within the agency?
Yes, I call it girding our loins, if you will. That's a critical part of this. And I think, we are trying to institutionalize things in various different ways. But as I alluded to, the culture is everything, right? We need to have a cadre of folks who know what's right and what's wrong. And we do have that. We're very lucky. With the release of the new policy, we will be releasing a new onboarding training. So every single new employee must take that onboarding training. And in fact, we are beginning discussions now to see if in the first year of the new policy, we can't make that onboarding training as a one-off required for the whole agency. In addition to that, I do a lot of speaking, a lot of training, a lot of outreach. Our scientific integrity officials do a lot of outreach and training to folks. So that's really key. One of the cool things that we just did this year and last year are performance. When you get evaluated at EPA, you meet with your supervisor at least twice a year. So for all senior executive service, STs, SLs, SES, they and any GS supervisor now are specifically accountable for scientific integrity in the criteria that they are reviewed on. So that's another way that, hey, this matters, right? This is something. So we know that there'll be teachable moments, we hope, at least twice a year in that realm. But we really encourage, the administrator sends out a mass mailer. Deputy Administrator Janet McCabe is very on board with this and, mentions it. And in fact, March 28th, we will be having our internal annual scientific integrity meeting. And at that meeting, we will hear from Janet, we will hear from our chief scientist, and from me on the status of scientific integrity at the agency. So that's a tiny little droplet of all the things that we do.
Yeah, no,
but building that culture
yeah.
is most important. Now, we also have the Subcommittee on Scientific Integrity under the National Science Technology Council. That group will be there institutionalized regardless of the administration. And that's really key because they will also be able to help scientific integrity officials when there's political interference at their agency that they don't feel empowered to look at. They can reach out to that group to pull folks from other agencies to help. But it's not perfect. The pendulum swings, but we are trying to be as ready as we can.
Thank you, Dr. Griffo. I did have just a quick question. It's just more of it's an actual question. As you have been rolling this out, I just wonder if I cannot think of a downside for the things that you're doing, right? But I'm not sure if it's like preaching to the choir situation, but I'm just wondering, have you gotten pushback? Has anyone say, oh, this is going to slow us down or we can't do that? I'm just curious to see if you've gotten any pushback or is everyone really welcoming this and grateful for it?
Well, what I like to say is everybody loves scientific integrity until it applies to them. So yeah, it's tough. I mean, we have court order deadlines. We have, deadlines and statutes. We have a lot of things that push us to do things quickly and effectively and efficiently. And there is tension between the timeliness and taking the time to fully consider all the science. There's tension. I'm not going to say that there isn't. I would like to think that in most instances, that tension is resolved to make sure that, in fact, we do what we're supposed to do, because there's a lot of things in the statutes besides deadlines, right? We have a lot of things in there that we're supposed to be doing. So we can't overly focus on the deadline, but we also can't completely ignore the deadline. And we have masters, on Capitol Hill. We have masters in industry and, all over. We have many, many external constituencies that really are very, watching those deadlines very closely. So it's tough. It's tough. And we do our best. And sometimes when it doesn't work, that's when people call us and we look into it and try to work through it with folks. But yeah, there is definitely a tension there.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
But not all tension is bad.
No, it's good. It's good. Tension can be good. That's what we have to do, work through it. So no, I completely.
Exactly.
Any other questions for Dr. Griffo? All right. Well, then I want to thank you for this excellent presentation and for bringing this information to us. I'm happy to see it. I really am. So.
And thank you, and thank all of you for your service to the agency. We really appreciate it. Be well, everyone.
Thank you. So now we will move to the next item on our agenda. We're a little ahead of time. We did not have any public commenters, so that put us ahead a few minutes. So that's, but I would like to just move ahead to the next agenda item, which is our quality review of the SAB draft report, review of the Clean Air Status and Trends Ambient Air Monitoring Network, or CASNet. Quality review of the SAB panel and committee reports is a key function of the chartered SAB. The board must make a determination about the quality of all draft reports. So we'll hear a brief introduction from the chair of this panel, Dr. Godfrey Uzochukwu, chair of the SAB CASNet review panel, and several members of the panel will also be speaking with him. We'll then hear comments from SAB members designated as lead reviewers, and those are Doctors Marjorie A. Leon, Susan Annenberg, and Drew Schindel. After hearing lead reviewer comments, I'll ask Dr. Uzochukwu if he would like to provide a brief response to any comments or questions, and then I'll ask SAB members for any additional comments as part of the quality review discussion. And our discussion will focus on the four questions that are responsibility of the chartered SAB. They are: one, whether the original charge questions to the SAB panel were adequately addressed; two, whether there are any technical errors or omissions in the report or issues that are inadequately dealt with in the panel's report; three, whether the panel's report is clear and logical; and four, whether the conclusions drawn or recommendations provided are supported by the body of the SAB panel's report. So I would now ask Dr. Uchukwu to summarize the report. And I believe three members of the CASNet review panel, Katie Pradell, Dirk Felton, and Stephanie Shaw, are also attending this meeting and will be assisting Dr. Uzochukwu by summarizing the findings and recommendations in parts of the report. So, Dr. Uzochukwu, I will now, I see you. I will now cede the floor to you, and hopefully you can share your screen if you'd like.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jones. Good afternoon, everyone. I am, as you know, your colleague on the Science Advisory Board, and I was honored to chair the panel charged by this board to review the Clean Air Status and Trends Network. This network, known and referred to as CASNet, is a long-term rural ambient air monitoring network established more than 30 years ago. It was designed to evaluate the spatial patterns and the temporal trends in air pollution after the implementation of the Clean Air Act Amendment of 1990. The agency charged the board to investigate the network and respond to several charge questions regarding the possible evolution of the network. The review panel was formed and met several times to deliberate upon the questions and to render advice to the agency. Slide, please. Okay, as you can see, the panel was made up of diverse membership, including colleagues from the board, Dr. Florence Anoro, Ms. Lisa Lomfight, and others currently serving in academia and industry. The panel also includes distinguished members of the air pollution academic community, including researchers deploying the next generation of research-grade ambient air monitoring networks for criteria pollutants such as Atmospheric Science and Measurement Network, ACCENT, funded by National Science Foundation. I'm deeply grateful and send my heartfelt thanks to all members of this panel. It has been a pleasure to work with all of you. And now, to give you a sense of the variety and the experience that contributed to our deliberations and recommendations, I would like to allow 3 members of the panel to introduce themselves and share their perspectives about this network, its value, and our work reviewing it. First will be Dick Felton from New York Department of Environmental Conservation. Next will be Dr. Stephanie Shah from EPRI. And then will be Dr. Katie Pradell from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Dirk, Stephanie, and Katie, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm a research scientist with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. I've got 30 years of experience in urban and rural air quality monitoring. And participating on the review panel has reminded me of why measurements in rural areas are so important. The CASNet program started in the 1980s, which coincided with some of the highest NOx, SO2, and acidic deposition across the state of New York and the Adirondacks specifically. This area has almost no local sources, but is susceptible to acidification from pollutants transported into the region. NACS monitors are established based on population thresholds and are not usually located in rural areas. CASNet met the need for speciated gas and particle data in rural areas. And I don't know, can we show the 2 plots I had? I'm not sure if there we go, great. So here's a plot showing CASNet sulfate data along with SO2 emissions from the National Emissions Inventory. And on the right side, actually there's one plot before this, if we can go to that one first. This one's deposition, the previous one is concentration. There we go. Yep, so on the right axis, we've got the kilograms per hectare. And we can go to the next one. There we go. And the green line is the sulfate deposition threshold value. This was established in 1980 for New York's acid rain control program. This value in kilograms per hectare was thought to be unattainable at that time. CASNet data were used to justify the need for emissions reductions that led to lower ambient concentrations, and later, CASNet data were used in accountability studies to show that the reductions were effective. How about the future? Just last week, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments about the Good Neighbor Plan, which aims to reduce air pollution that drifts from one state to another. Downwind states continue to need CASNet data to provide evidence showing that controls on emissions reduce pollution. In New York State, 44 years after that threshold value was set for sulfate, the need for rural monitoring is not over. Nitrate is increasing at some sites, as is ammonia. Long-term monitoring is the only way to know for sure if additional controls will be necessary to protect the environment. In the meantime, and if you're planning a visit, pH in Adirondack lakes is slowly increasing, and brook trout once again can be found in Brook Trout Lake. Thanks.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Shaw, and I'm a technical executive at EPRI with 25 years of experience in air quality monitoring, FATE, and transport research. For 10 years, I managed the Southeastern Aerosol Research and Characterization Air Quality Monitoring Network, or SEARCH, led by EPRI, Southern Company, and other electric power companies. SEARCH had 4 urban-rural paired sites that operated for 20 years, regularly measured several dozen gas and aerosol metrics, most on a continuous basis, hosted numerous campaigns with academic, national lab, and industry scientists for atmospheric insights and instrument validation, and led or was heavily involved with over 300 peer-reviewed journal publications as of last count. While the network was regional, the insights learned are applicable elsewhere and have been incorporated into tools the entire community uses for assessments across the country for air quality, health, visibility, and ecosystem impacts. In that way, there are many, many similarities to CASNet, and I am grateful to have had the opportunity to provide my thoughts on its quality and review. My experience demonstrates that long-term monitoring networks are absolutely critical for documenting pollution trends, uncovering pollution source attribution, and providing accountability for regulatory, policy, and voluntary emission reduction actions, including our focus on disadvantaged communities. Policymakers, regulatory agencies, scientists, researchers, and those managing the affected facilities that may be responsible for pollution all need transparency and consistency in the data used to make those determinations. CASNet has effectively done this for decades. This has been very successful because the methods have generally been unchanged. Sites have remained in operation, and the stored samples and data files are managed with a long-term mindset to facilitate their ongoing use even after measurements may cease. This is even more important when the key past and future network objectives are related to climate and ecosystem impacts, which by definition occur on long-term timeframes. As the report states, only now have some metrics been collected long enough to perform the types of statistical analysis necessary for confident attribution of changes in surface ozone air pollution, specifically climate change. Katie?
Thanks, Stephanie. Well, my name is Katie Pradel. I'm the Air Monitoring Section Chief for the State of Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. I started my career with the state in air monitoring about 20 years ago as a field operator, and I've advanced through my roles gradually. And in my role now, I manage Wisconsin's statewide ambient air pollutant regulatory monitoring efforts, and I often support projects that utilize air quality sensors. I'm a member of the National Association of Clean Air Agencies Monitoring Steering Committee, where I collaborate with other monitoring experts like Dirk from around the country. Having advanced through my career from air monitoring field operation on the ground training to project coordination to now policy management, I have a unique perspective on the effort, cost, and value of each regulatory grade air monitoring site. And as budgets remain stagnant and operational costs increase, prioritization of sites can be difficult to decipher without first understanding the goals of monitoring in a particular location relative to the pollutant being monitored. So for example, Wisconsin, as Dirk had mentioned, similarly is heavily impacted by transported emissions. As such, ozone has been a persistent air quality issue in Wisconsin for decades. And our air quality monitoring priorities are probably going to look a lot different than any other state that doesn't have this transported emission challenge. So for decades, we've been focusing on determining transported ozone by installing additional regulatory monitors, studying ozone formation chemistry, and conducting research campaigns along Lake Michigan's shoreline. With this being the focus early on in my career, the value of rural sites was not as apparent to me until being part of this panel. It really changed my perspective and made me see that understanding air quality issues to develop local policy in urban, downwind, and environmental justice areas is not possible without CASNet's long data record and rural air monitoring site locations. To echo Dirk and Stephanie and Uzo, for facing issues like air quality impacts from climate change, environmental justice, and even lowering NAAQS, policymakers need CASNet's data now more than ever to develop comprehensive plans for addressing modern air quality challenges. With that, I think I'll pass it back over to Uzo.
Okay, thank you very much for those remarks. The panelists will remain on the line to answer any questions during the quality review that the board members may have to discuss. One last thing I would like to highlight is what we believe may be a unique and valuable contribution of this panel. The method in Appendix A to evaluate monitoring network design or to rank specific site selection choices relative to each other is particularly variable, we think. The panel developed the Appendix A tool that takes on the difficult challenge of prioritization. First step to using the tool is to identify the policy goal and then weight the value of the site. As you can see, this generally applicable method goes well beyond just CastNet in this application, and preliminary use in the state of Wisconsin has proven valuable already. Before we move to quality review, I would like to thank the EPA and its staff for all of its support to the panel in its efforts, specifically to Dr. Richard Weber and his staff for all those information they provided and the rapid responses they had in providing answers to our questions. I believe they are also on the line if you should have any question. Special thanks to Tom Brennan, who also attended our meetings and provided guidance. We are grateful to the board for the quality review and look forward to your comments and any questions you may have as we move to finalize and transmit the consensus report. I have reviewed the comments submitted in writing, and I'm grateful for the edits you have suggested. We will incorporate them before the report is finalized. I also want to specifically acknowledge the comments of Dr. Annenberg and Dr. Chakraborty. I believe the comments regarding EJ and the EJ tools mentioned in our CAST network report can be significantly expanded during the deliberations of the recently formed EJ panel that you are both part of, along with Dr. Florence Anoro, who was also a member of this CASNet review panel. Your suggestions regarding EDI's mentioning of additional EJ evaluation tools can easily be incorporated. The more thought-provoking ideas you raised regarding EJ and real monitoring will be an important consideration to add to the EJ panel as it considers the overall analytical framework for EJ analysis to be conducted by the agency in the future. Special thanks to Dr. Brian Bloomer. He was everything. He provided us with everything that we needed to be able to write the report and kept us focused. Also, the CASNet panel colleagues, lead writers, lead reviewers, registered guests, all were very useful in preparing this report. Thank you all on behalf of the CASNet review panel. As we know, the mission of EPA is to protect human health and the environment. Dr. Jones, I'll turn it back over to you to lead us through the quality review discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much to you and your team for your comments and your quality review. I now would like to ask the lead reviewers for their comments in response to the quality review question. So first, I'd like to ask Dr. Leon if she would like to provide her comments.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Yes, the first, I just want to say I thought the report was very well written and detailed, and really commend the group for providing such a great report. And I think for me, some of the important points that were made by the previous speakers, but also that came across very clearly in the report, is just how important this CASNet program is. And it's really such a unique historical record and in unique areas, locations that some of these sampling sites have been selected that fill an enormous gap. And already mentioned rural areas, for example. One of the important points I think that the report really made, EPA, is with these economic considerations, thinking about reducing the number of sites, which would have a huge negative impact on this program. And so I appreciated that the report really suggested, as I would agree, that the sampling instead, if there is an economic consideration that has to be addressed, instead go to bi-weekly sampling from weekly sampling and not reduce the number of sites, because then you just break the record, the continuous record, in terms of location. Also, I thought another important point that was made was that if there does need to be an elimination of sites, that there were some sort of criteria that were provided by the report as suggestions to EPA. And one, for example, is that to examine the loss of model predictive power, so accuracy and precision, when data from a particular site under consideration from elimination would be removed. And so I think that does give EPA some good guidance. I mean, I hope that these sites are not eliminated, but so I thought that the report was very helpful in that respect also. I would like to say that, going more specifically to the quality, to the questions, that I thought that the report was really detailed and did address the charge questions. I thought that there really were no specific technical errors or emissions, but I thought a few additions that might be helpful. In a couple of places in the report, there were specifics of replacing the old sensors with newer sensors, and I thought it might be helpful to specify what the benefits would be more specifically than were detailed in the report, simply because in terms of also an economic analysis, I think that can be a justification from that perspective, as opposed to strictly the scientific perspective. So I thought it might just be helpful to add a sentence with just a little bit. Would there be cost savings, for example, by deploying new ozone sensors? Would the cost be the same? Would they perhaps increase, at least to just address that issue? Also, a very important point is not only to save money or thinking about, well, maybe go to biweekly sampling, is how to select the site locations. A comment was made about the geographic gap in CastNet in the central US, spanning from North Dakota to Texas, which is coming from New England, where our states are tiny. That's a pretty large geographic area. And how to really close that gap if funds were available to expand this program. I thought it could be referenced again to Appendix A, which Uzo mentioned. And if there's a more specific way to really do that site selection for such a large geographic area, given the economic constraints. So I found that the table 2 was really helpful in terms of thinking about just how vast these geographic areas are and the limitations in the sampling numbers. I think that'll be a big challenge, obviously, to EPA, and as much information as can be provided will certainly assist the program. And I had one question about the comments about the measurements of aero allergens, and that report said that thought that was not an important analysis to make or to add to the current CastNet locations. And I was wondering if that was everybody in the group agreed with that, or if there was some discussion about it, given that EPA's objective is to protect human health and the environment. The first section of the report related to that talks about all the good things that would.
Like, I come back and it's like, wait, why's the power dead?
Someone in the SAB office needs to mute. Okay, they did. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry. Go ahead.
And so, and then the next couple paragraphs suggest why aero allergens maybe shouldn't be included. But I will say in EPA's background report, EPA brings forward the suggestion. So the idea, just to read a little bit, says it's from the report, it is also not clear to the SAB that aeroallergen measurements would be in the domain of EPA's responsibility, e.g. are aeroallergens considered air pollutants, question mark. I thought I would probably suggest deleting that, and it seems that EPA could probably determine whether that's some area that they want to move toward, that EPA considers it part of its purview or not. So I just had a suggestion on also a little bit of a change in the language of the recommendation, and maybe to revise one of the sentences. And I thought it was a really good suggestion to reestablish a monitoring and methods subcommittee that the report made, and that committee would be an excellent way for the EPA to consider further whether or not aeroallergens is something to consider or not. And other than that, I think it was, like I said, a really excellent report. I made a few other small comments, so I won't go into those. But one other just last thing about the appendix and the table 2 that I just had a confusion on, and it's probably just me, but there's a column, a couple of rows that are, this is on page A3, where it's listed the site is new and greater than 500 miles from another CastNet site, parentheses 6 levels out with existing site metrics, where yes garners a 6, but then another row of site is new and greater than 500 miles from another CastNet site, yes equals 5. And I was unclear what the difference in those two rows were. And I'll stop there.
Sorry, I have to unmute. Thank you for those comments. And I'll just ask, I know you asked a couple direct questions. Did anyone want to respond just very briefly to her? I know, and Dr. Izuchuko, you will get a chance at the end to respond to all the lead reviewers. So why don't we just go ahead, but I just wanted you to just keep in mind those couple direct questions, clarifying statements. So our next lead reviewer is Dr. Annenberg.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones, and congratulations to this committee. I thought it was an excellent report as well, and really second the sentiment that, well, I guess maybe third the sentiment, because the committee said this in the report and Dr. Elian just agreed with it, that this is quite an important data source, and one that really provides a unique value added in many different applications. And my opinion is also increasingly important as climate change begins to unfold and have increasing influence over wildfires and dust and other types of sources of air pollutants that are not concentrated in urban areas. So overall, I thought the report was very well written and that the charge questions were adequately addressed. I noted two main important topics that I did not think were adequately dealt with in the report. One is dust, and that is because dust is also climate sensitive, as is wildfire smoke. And so in many places in the report that talk about the importance of CastNet monitoring for wildfire smoke, I thought that dust from the ground that is becoming more arid and leading to more entrainment of dust into the air, those were all places, all the places that are discussing wildfires currently could also be discussing dust concentrations, and that would be an important value added of the CastNet monitoring as well. So particularly in the Southwest US, this is important, and there have been studies showing how climate change is driving large increases in airborne dust concentrations in this part of the country. So that would be my first suggestion of an important topic to include in the report. The second is integration with satellite data. The report already discusses the potential use of low-cost sensors to fill in information between the monitors. And I thought for this, particular set of geographies, satellite data could be very valuable. It is difficult to use satellite data right now to discern ground level ozone, but the scientific community has been working very hard over a period of decades to develop algorithms and methods for estimating ground level PM 2.5 based on satellite remote sensing of things like aerosol optical depth. So this is something that is becoming a mature technology, a mature set of data sources. And with new satellite launches, particularly those that are geostationary and taking more temporally complete measurements over the United States during daylight hours, this is an ever increasingly valuable data source as well. So I just recommend that the report consider integration of CASNet monitoring with satellite data and how satellite data can be valuable for this purpose. Otherwise, I had just small specific technical errors that I won't go through here. In terms of the report being clear and logical, overall, yes, definitely. I did just want to highlight, first of all, I want to commend the committee for Appendix A. I really thought that was a valuable resource that went beyond the charge questions. It might have just been me, I don't know, but I thought the tables with the explanatory text and examples were a useful way to describe the suggested approach, but I didn't completely follow how the tables should be used to prioritize sites. It wasn't really clear what the relation between tables 1 and 2 was. Just maybe some additional explanatory text could be helpful there. And then just making clear also that for the last question, are the conclusions drawn or recommendations provided supported by the body of the draft report? Overall, yes, but I would have liked to see the recommendations, a little bit of a clear connection between the recommendations and the charge questions. And potentially the recommendations could also be linked, especially for charge question 1, the recommendations could be linked to the 4 objectives of CASNet too. So, but overall, yes, I thought that the recommendations were supported by the body of the draft. And that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Annenberg. Lastly, I'll ask Dr. Schindel for his comments.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Yeah, I would echo what we've just heard from my colleagues, Dr. Elion and Dr. Annenberg, that I thought this was an excellent review that the panel had carried out, and that the draft read in general very well. So in fact, I can be pretty quick because I don't have very many comments to offer. A little more detail in the written version, but just a few small things where there's one issue that also Dr. Annenberg just raised, that in the future we might have some changes in things like we expect to have changes in fires and dust, and it might be useful to see if there was a way for EPA to consider the potential changes in sightings. So not only what locations that are, say, currently downwind of fires, but locations that might be expected to be so in the future. I think, and I noted this a small thing, but the regulations have recently changed for PM, so it would be good to, when talking about the current standard, to make it clear exactly which current standard that is, which depends on the exact time you wrote the draft relative to the recently announced change in the PM thresholds. The other thing, the only real other issue, in fact, to raise is that when it came to things like environmental justice, I thought that the report did a really good job of pointing out the implications. I think in the future, as we continue to make progress, hopefully, in reducing many of the main anthropogenic sources of PM, the balance is likely to shift. It's already been shifting in some places, but I think as we shift to areas, for example, with more exposure to wildfire PM and dust PM, that we may find as the epidemiology continues to advance that there is a different impact of those particular PM types. And I know that there's a fair bit of research going on right now, in particular with fires. So we might in the very near future have a sense that, say, fire smoke is different than generic PM 2.5. And as the fires are going to affect different populations, that could end up having a substantial impact on who is affected. So I know the report was not very positive about the prioritization of speciation which is a difficult measurement to take for PM 2.5, but I do think that over the longer term, there is a possibility that might become a more important consideration, both for understanding general health impacts and environmental justice implications of things like changing fires. So I think that might be worth a little bit of additional consideration, that even if it's not our top priority right now to get speciated PM 2.5, it might become substantially more important in the near term. Again, that's really it. And I think that the panel did an excellent job. I found the tables and the guidance to EPA about ways to both minimize costs potentially while not cutting some of the long-term monitoring stations to be very useful. Like Dr. Annenberg said, I did find the relationship between some of the tables and a little bit of the details of how one might use those a little confusing, but I really appreciated the panel trying to guide EPA in their decision-making. That's all from me. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Shindell. I'll now ask Dr. Uzuchukwu if you would like to respond to the comments and or answer the direct questions from the lead reviewers.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jones. I will begin by responding to the dust. The question about dust, we can incorporate that with wildfires quite easily. And I'll ask my colleagues, Dirk and Stephanie. And
Sure. I can mention the dust comment was it's well received. Many of the folks on the review committee recommended adding continuous PM sensors. And that's because the CastNet program doesn't weigh filters and doesn't really look at black carbon individually. So there's no good way to track forest fires. And I'm kind of surprised that the review of this program did not also take into account Improve, which does look at fugitive dust and haze. And I'm not sure why these two programs are separate. In my mind, they certainly look at rural areas for similar pollutants, but not in this case. What was the other one? Oh, aeroallergens. I could mention that one quickly. A lot of the folks were interested in the ecological impacts of potentially seeing different species move over time and being able to track that using aeroallergens. The difference there would be that people who want the pollen reports live in urban areas, and it wouldn't make the most sense to use CastNet sites for that. That could be something like an NCORE or even a state site might be more appropriate for that.
Yeah, and I would add that the method wasn't really well developed yet. So I think there, as you rightly noted, there wasn't really consensus among the group that we would make that a suggested path forward for EPA. But like you said, it's something to consider down the road through a different panel. And then I think Stephanie and I could probably take on the Appendix A questions. I'll just talk about like the different tables and the examples, because this was all in our head and we kind of put it down in a table, and that is clear from the feedback that we're receiving, but we realize how important it is to be able to, for EPA and even other states, to figure out a way to kind of show your work when you're moving sites, or and it's important to really articulate the goal of the site, which hasn't always happened in the past. So that's what we're trying to develop this tool to do. So I think we would approach.
I'm sorry, Katie. Wait.
Yeah.
I'm here in background. If everybody could just please make sure you are muted if you're not speaking, it would be fantastic. I'm sorry. Here.
I think we could address this comment by creating like we would just need a little more time to create like a manual and then give more narrative behind each of the tables and what they could be used for, and even have a couple of us kind of go. I was the only one that kind of used it on my network to go through it and see if it worked. So we could maybe share it around with the panel and see if they can use it and get feedback and then revise it a little bit to help with that. Because it makes sense in my mind because we developed it, but I get that that's not really getting out there in the report. And Stephanie, I'll let you add whatever you think.
Yeah, I agree with Katie that, clear communication is obviously the goal, just like clear decision making. So we can tweak the explanations as to how, it enhance how the use case might, you might go through that with more text. But I will say that I think what we realize, the reason we have these tables is that for a network as complex as CastNet, and the same thing would be true for Improve or NCORE as well, there are a lot of objectives that the network is designed to address. And any given site may meet multiple objectives or just one. And any given measurement may be particularly helpful for a specific question, but not for others. And so when you have such a multi-dimensional network, you can't make a decision on a single dimension, right? You have to be able to account for all of the contributing factors that might go into the value of a measurement or site. And so I just want to, again, point out that this is not meant to be prescriptive in terms of a decision-making tool, but more of an example. And it could be applied to other networks or specific questions that differ from the examples that we provide in the report. But the idea is to be able to actually document those metrics on which a decision might be made and why one site or measurement might be more valuable to another. So that was the goal. I hope that it seems like that came across, although specific use needs a bit more instruction. So thanks so much for that feedback.
Thank you so much, all of you, for addressing the
Dr. Jones, I want to make one
go ahead.
more point. Appendix A was not in the charge question. But when you have enthusiastic people who want to make things better, as Stephanie said, it was all in their head, so they put it together on paper. So it's not a decision-making tool. But so I would just want to make that point. It wasn't part of the charge question. We just added it to add value to the report.
Understood. Are there any other, I like to give the panel just another opportunity to respond. Did you want to respond to any of the other comments from elite reviewers?
Well,
Sorry, go ahead, Weasel.
Yeah, all comments are outstanding comments. It takes time to really detail what we read and the feedback, and not only asking questions, but they were also answering the questions. So we shall incorporate all the edits, all the comments in the revision, in the final report.
Thank you. I'd now like to open the discussion to your comments on a report from any other SAB members or liaison in attendance, and I saw a couple hands. I think I saw Joe Arvai's hand go up first. Joe, Dr. Arvai, do you want to?
Yeah, and I apologize. I put my hand up early, so I think I got to be first simply because I jumped the gun. I very much appreciated the opportunity to read this report and to learn a little bit about what CastNet is meant to do. And I appreciate the comment that was just made about Appendix A being not part of the charge questions, but added to be a piece of supplemental material from the committee. Appendix A actually was probably the most helpful thing to me because it helped me to contextualize what CastNet was trying to do. And it compelled me to write in my comments for the record, but also this comment that I'll make now. It compelled me as probably the only decision scientist on the SAB to to just sort of raise the point that whenever we talk about initiatives that are meant to support decision-making that involve prioritization, that involve making trade-offs against multiple or across multiple criteria, that involve different levels of impact or levels of impact that would be sensitive to how important a particular objective or criterion is. There's an entire field of science devoted to doing this, and it didn't really come across to me in the report that field of science was consulted or brought into the conversation around how CastNet might be further optimized. So it's not so much a comment on a specific part of the report, but really more of a broad comment that whenever this happens, you know, in the EPA, certainly involving SAB input, you know, I would really urge, I guess, the staff office as much as anyone to, when these committees are formed, to make sure that there's adequate representation from the decision sciences, because I'm unable to go in. I just don't have the level of depth of understanding of CastNet as a decision scientist to be able to offer concrete recommendations on how CastNet could be further improved or optimized. But if someone like me or me was in the conversations about CastNet, it probably would have been a whole lot easier to understand. So it's really meant to be a positive comment for future initiatives or future reviews like this. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Dr. Beck?
Thank you very much. And I have a comment for clarification regarding Dr. Annenberg's comments about measurement of dust. And it relates to particle size issues, because typically, if we are thinking about windblown dust from terrestrial sources, particle sizes will be larger than particles derived from combustion sources. And I don't have an understanding of whether CastNet is able to address differences in particle size as a function of source, and whether that's something to be thinking about in the comments.
Anyone want to, oh, go ahead, Dr. Uzu.
Yeah.
Uzo,
Yes. Yeah, we will look at that and then incorporate it, because particle size, as you said, is very, very important. And what we are seeing today with climate change, there are all kinds of very, very tiny, tiny, tiny particles. So when we do the corrections, we certainly will address that.
Thank you.
I could respond a bit as well, if you like. Currently, CastNet does not really focus on PM mass or the elements necessary to really undertake some of the questions you're referring to. It's not a complete approach. And so we mentioned earlier that many of the people on the panel wanted to consider the addition of lower cost sensors to attempt to get a particle number, and then that gets converted to mass. And some of those low cost sensors do have the ability to do some amount of size fractionation, but their size distributions are different from more traditional kind of reference grade instruments that would be used in a state site. So that would definitely be something that would not need to go into the decision-making process if new measurements of PM mass and size were to be proposed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Hamburg?
Yeah, thanks so much. And great, really important work, and the report's great. And this is meant as a sort of query, comment, question. So I was struck by, in just doing a little bit of digging, right, in 2022, 15% of EPA sites in CastNet were suspended. I think that's right. I know they suspended some, and that seems to be the roughly the number. And in the report, and I may have missed it, and I apologize if I did, it was very prospective, which was critically important, but it also seemed important to be a bit retrospective in terms of what was lost by because these are complex patterns. And I noted at one point in the middle of the document, it said, in summary, CastNet has configured over the past decade, with some measurement locations extending back 30 years, has provided a valuable resource that could reliably support EPA in meeting many of its priority goals, but it isn't the same network as it was in the past decade. And it seems important to not just pass that up, but to comment on, because as I understand it again, and I'll stand corrected easily because I'm sure I could easily be wrong in this, that most of the sites that were suspended were tended to be more rural sites, and which are critically important in a lot of this, because if you don't understand the context, it's very hard to understand the implications for impacted communities. Because there is a lot of variability even outside of those communities. So I guess if somebody could unpack a little bit the retrospective aspect, to what degree you looked at, and how important is it to comment on what was lost already, in addition to if there is any skewing in the relative data between the more rural sites and the more populated sites, the impacted community sites, and to what degree that's a diminishing of the value, and whether that should be raised. And if I got it wrong and I missed some of it, I apologize for that.
Thank you for that. Any response?
Well, at least in New York, I can add that we saw the cuts coming and tried to respond in a way to minimize the impact. And for other sites that were funded by the state, we actually discontinued one that was what we considered to be the lowest value and replaced one that EPA was cutting, because that was the one that had the highest concentrations for upstate New York for transported pollutants. So, I don't know what would have happened if we had just sat back and waited for the cuts impacts to occur. We tried to minimize them to extent possible.
Okay, I just want to add that hopefully when we deliver this report, those sites will be brought back.
But it doesn't, and maybe I missed it, it doesn't say that does it make the case for that value of bringing them back? I think it should be explicit if it's not, and again, if I missed it, but I think it should be an explicit point. That's where I'm going, right? How much was lost with those cuts should be an explicit. At least I didn't see it in any of the high summaries, and as I was going through the text, and apologize, I may have read it too quickly, have a couple other things on happening, but go ahead, sorry.
I will say this is a kind of network where the data is available to everyone. So it's difficult to know sometimes who's using the data and how until it's too late and it's not there anymore. You'll find out a year or two down the road, oh, we were going to use that particular site. It's not there anymore.
But sorry to be back and forth, but there is the opportunity, as you did prospectively, right? The value of different data. And that's the role of the committee, is to opine on that and give the opinion of the SAB to say, look, this would create problems. It's not about just saying, exactly who would miss it, but to what degree is it critical or not?
Right.
All right. Thank you. Good conversation. Dr. Chakraborty.
Thank you. First of all, I congratulate this review panel or committee for compiling a really good report that addresses all charge questions in more adequate detail, which can sometimes be challenging. I just wanted to quickly add something that's kind of related to some of the written comments I've uploaded for this report. I feel that given the focus of CastNet on serving rural and disadvantaged communities, it may be useful or helpful to have a clear, consistent, and scientifically valid definition of both terms, disadvantaged and rural. And also looking at this from an environmental justice perspective, I found that in terms of locating or selecting sites, the use of only one screening tool, which is the CEQ's CGES tool, to identify disadvantaged communities can be a bit restrictive or problematic, in part because CGES was developed to guide federal investments for the Justice 40 initiative, and the focus was mainly on climate justice and economic justice. So it doesn't necessarily serve to say is that the tool was not designed to identify environmental justice communities are concerned. And of course, another related problem here is that CGES does not include any indicator of race or ethnicity, which is an essential component of EJ. So if advancing EJ is a goal, I recommend using other tools like the EPA's own EJ screen mapping and screening tool, or even the CDC's Environmental Justice Explorer that focus more specifically on EJ issues and concern, and also provide indicators I think that can be easily implemented to identify disadvantaged areas for CastNet. Thank you.
That was a suggestion, but is there a comment? Are there any?
No, I just wanted to, I guess my follow-up question would be, is there any efforts ongoing to explore other screening tools besides CJust?
Thank you.
Well, I think, as I said before, the EJ has a panel. So I think it's something for them to explore and then dig deeper and then look for other tools that can be used. Because CastNet, it wasn't really, it's not an EJ project. So right now, as Tom Brennan noted in the previous meetings, they have a self-initiated project where what Dr. Chakraborty was saying can fit in more appropriately.
Thank you. Dr. Anuro?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for all the comments. I just wanted to piggyback on what Dr. Ozachukwu mentioned. The different EJ screen tools were actually brought into discussion during our deliberations, but as he rightly stated, it wasn't the focus then wasn't too strictly or myopically focused on EJ, but we brought some of those to address some of the gaps, especially in those rural and disadvantaged communities. So hopefully those concerns will be addressed with the newly formed EJ panel. But also, one of the comments was on including the advantages, detailed comparisons of the low-cost monitoring tools that are recommended. And I think in the report, and unless if I'm not quite correct here, there was a discussion on the advantages of those low-cost monitoring systems that were recommended in the report. And maybe we need to put some more detailed in terms of costs, why they were relevant to the CastNet project, especially addressing those areas that there are big gaps in the rural and in the disadvantaged communities. So I just wanted to address that we did address some of those, the advantages of having them. And we also stated that we're not replacing the already existing tool, they're just complement what was already there, but mostly to bridge gaps and also to make it more customer or community friendly database analysis that they can understand and use in their day-to-day response to what is happening in the air quality. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Next, we have Dr. Guggenheimer.
I want to make a few comments. I also agree that it was a very good report. But I think that as I read the background document from the EPA, that they were asking the SAB for somewhat different kind of advice. I think that they were asking us for advice about how CastNet in the future should fit into national programs for air quality monitoring and sort of changes in devices, satellite data, And particularly the creation of CastNet was something that was largely motivated, as I understand it, by air pollution coming from coal-fired power plants and creating acid rain in downwind sites. And in the diagrams, the charts that we were shown earlier, that has really decreased substantially in the period since CastNet was created. And so whether the location of CastNet sites, the number of sites, how it fits in with local and other community monitoring efforts is something that EPA, I think, really is asking us to sort of re-examine. And I think that the report doesn't do that so much as it makes a strong argument for the importance of CastNet. But that importance of CastNet in terms of past efforts may be different from its importance in what happens in the future. To the extent that there is a strong consensus in the community that the measurements that are made by CastNet should continue to be made, then it seems to me that this may be an opportunity to transfer some of that effort to communities and get community groups involved in actually operating the CastNet sites in order to save money and enable EPA to maintain a larger monitoring program than it would otherwise. I'll stop there. Thank you.
As someone who works with coal-fired power plants and many other types of industry on their emissions and downwind impacts, I'll just start with a response to that comment. I think that's a good question, right? That's one, I think, of the many questions that was asked of us in this report. While we know that not just coal-fired power plant, but many other industrial emissions from the transportation and energy generation sector have been dropping rapidly. Dirk showed earlier some plots that demonstrate that, but you can also see that there's not a plateau. Those reductions still continue to happen. And additional regulatory actions in the past several years are going to make those continue to go further. And so while one of the many motivations for the origination of the network may see that sort of impact or that particular outcome slow, it's not stopped. And with many other regulatory actions that have happened, they need accountability as well. And this network is well served to do that. And over the years, its objectives have expanded dramatically. And that actually, kind of led to our appendix and decision-making tool. But if you look at the objectives that our panel noted specifically, we're talking about detecting and quantifying long-term trends. That's not just in NOx and SOx, but that's in ozone, and that's in other chemicals as well, and PM. We're talking about documenting geographic patterns, right? This rural bias of the sites. Looking at model and data product improvement. If you're going to look at air quality across this country and really get at community impacts, you need to have some representation, even in areas where you cannot have a monitoring site, no matter how many low-cost sensors you deploy. And to do that, we rely on modeling. To have accurate models, you need a network with broad geographic capabilities and that captures the unique features that CastNet does. So that's just the first 3 of 8 objectives, or sorry, 7 objectives we've tabulated. So I think this was one question that the panel did struggle with is, if we want to look at where CastNet's going in the future, are those still the right 7 objectives? Should there be more, or should we reduce those to focus? And so far, the deliberation of the panel has come to say that all of those 7 are important, and that the network as designed does contribute to all of them. And so that's the decision of the panel. So we need to understand what the EPA as a whole feels is the priority for those objectives moving forward too.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Zhu?
Well, thank you for the, I want to also want to congratulate the panel for an excellent report. I want to add something that echoes some of the comments and recommendations that the committee members made, particularly regarding the integration of the satellite data with the ground monitoring data. I think one thing I think we probably should make it clear is that whether we think integrating satellite data with ground monitoring data is on the purview of EPA versus, say, EPA's CASNet contributes to the foundation for future development of linking satellite data or other remote sensing technology with ground monitoring data. So we all know that there are rapid advances in utilizing satellite remote sensing data for environmental pollution monitoring and so on and so forth. There's several really interesting papers looking specifically at PM2.5 and black carbon due to wildfires in the entire United States. While the technology and the methodology and the models are quite promising and exciting, these results all show that the prediction or estimation of PM2.5 aerosol black carbon is subject to large amount of error, up to 50% relatively. So that means these, when compared with ground monitoring data, of course, we all know that ground monitoring data is very sparse in terms of spatial resolution. So that just says that in order for us to finesse the methodology using satellite data to predict air pollution, we need a lot more data in terms of spatial and the temporal resolution. Temporal resolution probably is less of a challenge. So for me, at this point, cuts the scope of CASNet is probably the wrong thing to do. So I support the recommendation of the panel that instead we should look at how could we strategically locate these sites and contribute further to the baseline of ground monitoring data to support the development of models to support the monitoring of air pollution. So that's my second comment. I'll stop here and I'll make sure that I put this in writing and submit to EPA. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zhu. Dr. Wilson?
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yeah, the echo of the comments, really extensively, developed report, lots of information. I wanted to just follow up on a couple comments from Dr. Chakraborty. First, about the use of the CGIS tool. I understand that, the Environmental Justice Panel is separate, but I do believe we're going to look at this disadvantage issue, as was said before. That tool is not an appropriate tool because race is the single most important predictor of environmental injustice, distribution of hazards, not income. So just want to co-sign on that. And I think another tool, because it's this element of climate change that could be looked at as well that wasn't mentioned before, or maybe it was in the report. I need to go back to the report, is the Climate Vulnerability Index tool. That's, I think, some of the team SAB members are on the call. I think had a role in developing that tool. So I would lean to EPA EJ Screen and also CVI and EJ Index, as Dr. Chakraborty mentioned, and then also go back to where I work with the EJ Screen work group. Some of the same discussions we had about, rural areas, I think it's relevant to the discussion that we're having about how to define, as Dr. Chakraborty mentioned. Getting to this point about, the future of CASNet, I really think it's important on the climate change side that CASNet may be useful to get at those issues in a better way, particularly in rural areas. We have a lot of agricultural operations in rural areas. Not sure how much CASNet is capturing their impact on air quality, But ammonia is a big deal when you think about concentrated animal feeding operations from, cattle feedlots in the plains and, Texas to in California to industrial chicken farms in Maryland and Delaware and Virginia to industrial hog farms in North Carolina. And those operations emit a lot of greenhouse gases, right? And also co-pollutants. And they also are sources of ammonia, which is a precursor for PM. So I think that's a place. I'm not sure how much that was covered in the report, but I think that's something that could be really looked to. And then also this comment about communities, having communities do it. I think that's an important comment, but there's a double-edged sword there, right? So there's a lot of hyperlocal air quality monitoring that's happened because of the gaps in monitoring networks in general, right? So it's the lack of spatial coverage and like a hyperlocalized monitoring, which I do a lot of. I think it's great if we could tap into those data sets, right? And we talked about this before. How do you really grade that data? How do you bring it in and the fit for purpose for that data? But I also think, so those networks are out there. We can tap into those networks, the APIs, et cetera, so I think it's a good thing. But also the side of the whole community system science side and having communities have to do that work too. It's already, particularly communities I work with who are already overburdened, right? And then I always get a pushback. We have to do the monitoring too, Dr. Wilson. So just being aware that sensitivity there. And my last point is, it would be great to have more discussion about low-cost sensors, integration of low-cost sensors in this report. There are a lot of sensors out there monitoring, our criteria air pollutants and non-criteria air pollutants, right? And so we're doing that work. We're using those sensors. They've been vetted. You have things from Modulaire. You have the Purpleware, which is not the best sensor. You have AQ, you have Quant AQ. There's a lot of really good companies that have really good sensors, and EPA is doing a lot of work on these sensors. And one last point, not sure if mobile monitoring is a relevant thing to include as you think about the suite of monitoring that could be as part of this casting a wide net. If we're going to cast a wide net, use that framing. But that may be another thing to think about as we think about how the cast net can be integrated with other types of monitoring, satellite and also mobile. So I'll pass the mic back.
Excellent, Dr. Wilson. Thank you. Dr. Thorne?
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on what Dr. Guggenheimer said and the response from Dr. Shaw. There's some recent evidence suggesting that much of the gains in PM made since 2000 have been erased since 2016 because of wildfire smoke exposure. And for I think 35 states is the number that comes to mind where this has been seen, but in particular, those of the Northwest, West, and Northern Rockies have seen the greatest impact in terms of even a reversal in terms of the gain. So those graphs we saw in the presentation where it's going down and down, we can expect from climate change, if the wildfires continue to go as they are, that we'll see that trend reverse as we're already seeing in the Western states. And this part of the country has huge swaths of rural area with very, very little municipal level monitoring available. And so we're really dependent upon programs like CastNet to provide the data to show the impacts of climate change on PM and ozone and other measured air quality measures. So I think, I think what I'm saying, maybe I'm pushing back a little bit on John Guggenheimer's comment that maybe these aren't needed so much anymore, but rather to think about this as a way to celebrate the gains we've made, but then be wary of losing those gains because of new emerging sources like windblown dust or especially wildfire smoke. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Guggenheimer, did you have a response?
Yeah, let me start my video. Yeah, so I appreciate that. And one of the things that I said in my written comments is that there are hardly any CastNet sites in the Northwest. If you look at Oregon and Washington, there weren't coal-fired power plants there. And presumably because CastNet was developed to monitor pollutions from those sites primarily, they didn't put any sites there. So in reevaluating the current state of what the nation needs to do with regard to air quality monitoring, Maybe we need to build some new sites. Maybe we need fewer sites. Maybe we need to really understand what the spatial variance is in the concentrations of pollutants. With things like fires, it's extreme, and probably more so than it has been with regard to the pollutant, the sulfur and nitrogen pollution that has been widespread downwind from power plants. And so I view this as an opportunity to re-examine and plan for the future. And I'd just like to see the SAB be as helpful as it can to the EPA in engaging in that process.
So, there's several places in the report where it refers to a paucity of monitoring stations from North Dakota to Texas. It says nothing about the Northwest that I recall seeing. So maybe that should be the addition that is suggested.
Good point. I will also know, well, first, let me just ask if there are any other, I don't see any other hands. Dr. Kopp, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And I had not intended to speak at all today, but Dr. Wilson's comment about confined or concentrated animal feeding operations and the mention of the swath through the middle of the U.S. where we may be losing capabilities reminds me that these samples, especially archive samples for PM, could come in very handy in assessments of things that we're not really even considering right now. Some of the work we've done out in the panhandle of Texas and Oklahoma demonstrates particulate matter that contains concentrations of anabolic steroids and growth promoters that are ecologically relevant concentrations, and also other work by folks showing antibiotic resistant bacteria on those particular particulate matters. And this is at fence line or beyond. So it's not like things that are happening right in the middle of the feedlot. Simply wanted to echo or amplify what Dr. Wilson was saying. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you for making that comment. Any other comments from the board or liaisons? All right. Well, seeing that, I would like to just remind everyone, if you have not already, because I heard some excellent comments, very nice suggestions during this discussion. So I know many of you have submitted, you may have submitted comments in writing, but if you have not, I would just, please mute everybody. If you
Yeah, but good. How y'all doing?
Dr. Wilson, I think we can hear your background.
Uh-oh, sorry.
It's okay. So just remind everyone, if you haven't already, just to submit any other written comments for the panel to review. And now it is time for us to determine the disposition of this report.
Dr. Jones, can
go
I
ahead.
just say one
Do
thing?
you have a comment? Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I just want to say that the panel finds CastNet as a high-value resource to state, local, and tribal agencies. Our network is valuable, particularly in the features of spatial coverage, national consistency, and more important, long-term data record. And then the critical placement for involving national ambient air monitoring system over the next 10 years or more. So it's a very, very valuable resource for EPA to have. And they will continue to get better. So this is not the end of it. Keep getting better and better and better. Thank you.
Thank you, Uzo. So now it's time for us to determine the disposition of this report. So I just want to explain the process. I'll ask for a motion for an SAB decision on the draft report, and I'll ask that it be seconded. Then I'll ask for a voice vote on whether to approve the motion. So I'd like to note that members of the chartered SAB, not liaisons, should vote. And motions can fall in following categories. It can be approval of the report, either as is or subject to editorial changes and review by the chair only. It can be approval of the report subject to re-review by designated board members. It could be return of the draft report to the authoring panel for further work so that a revised report can be brought before the board for a second quality review. Or we could also recommend that the SAB staff office constitute an entirely new committee or panel to complete the advisory activity. So I would now like to request a motion and that it be seconded.
I move that we accept the report, subject to minor revisions that can be approved by the chair of the SAB.
I second the motion.
Thank you. I heard a motion and I heard a second. So just to repeat, the motion by Dr. Guggenheimer was that this report be approved, subject to editorial changes and review by the SAB chair. And that motion was seconded. There's discussion, Dr. Thorne.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that there was quite a bit of comment about Appendix A, and perhaps that needed some additional clarifying language. And that might be something where Dr. Uzucheku would appreciate the assistance of those who primarily authored that section. So it's a friendly amendment to allow the chair of the panel to bring in the expertise from the panel for that component of the revision.
Fine with me.
Is that okay? Do you accept
Yes,
that?
that's fine with me.
Okay. So the amended motion is to approve the report subject to review by the chair, but that it would go back to the panel as it usually does for an update specifically on all the comments, but specifically regarding Appendix A, because there was quite a lot of discussion on Appendix A. And then I can review those comments in the updated report. Does that capture your okay, thank you, Dr. Thorne. All right, Dr. Guggenheimer, all agree. So I'll now like to call the question. All those in favor of the motion, please respond by saying aye.
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 Any oppositions, please respond by saying nay. Are there any abstentions? Excellent. It sounds like this motion passed. It was unanimous. I did not hear any abstentions. So thank you to everyone. I do want to really thank the authoring panel for this excellent report. It was you went over and beyond the charge to present to us a very helpful guide that I think will be upon revision, be really, really useful to EPA. So I just want to thank everyone, the lead reviewers and the entire board for your really helpful comments on this report. We're a little ahead of schedule. We had scheduled a 10-minute break right now. We're about almost 40 minutes ahead of schedule. So I think we'll probably end earlier today. So what I would like to propose is that we take a break, that we just go ahead and take our 10-minute break now as scheduled, and then we come back and finish our meeting probably a little bit earlier. So if that's okay, please take a break and come back at 10 Eastern, come back to about 2:20 Eastern time, if you could. Thank you, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. We'll wait maybe one more minute for folks to get back to their user. Thank you. I see you're here. Hopefully, folks are back. Dr. Bond, when you get here, if you could share your camera, just so I'll know that you are here because you're our next speaker.
I am here.
Oh, good, good. There you are. Thank you. All right. So I say we get started. I think folks are back, so we will continue with the next item on our agenda, which is a discussion of the SAB work group draft report on the proposal to revise new source performance standards and emission guidelines for greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel fired electric generating units. And so the regulation identifier number for this action is RIN 2060AV09. The proposed rule, which was referred to in the draft SAB report as the greenhouse gas power plant rule, was published in the Federal Register on May 23rd, 2023. A supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking was published in the Federal Register on November 20th, 2023, announcing the availability of and soliciting comment on an initial regulatory flexibility analysis. So the SAB is reviewing the science supporting this rule as part of our statutory duties. The SAB is required by law to receive information from EPA about the science supporting plant regulatory actions when they are provided to any other federal agency for formal review and comment. And the board may then decide to review the adequacy of the scientific and technical basis of the plan actions. At an SAB meeting on June 23rd, 2023, the board discussed the proposed greenhouse gas power plant rule and decided that the SAB should review the science supporting this rule. After the meeting on June 23rd, the SAB staff office formed a work group chaired by Dr. David Allen to review the proposed rule, and the work group developed a draft report on the rule. Work group member Dr. Tammy Bond, who is here today, took the lead in developing the draft report on this proposed rule. The SAB work group considered the proposed rule and developed a draft report that's been posted on the SAB website. Links to the proposed rule and the supplemental proposal reviewed by the work group are provided in the draft report. I'd now like to discuss the draft report and reach consensus on any changes or additions needed before it's transmitted to the EPA as a final SAB report. So to begin this discussion, I'll ask Dr. Bond to provide a brief summary of the work group report, and then I'll ask for comments and discussions from all SAB members. In our discussions, I want to reach consensus on any changes needed in the report, and we can also discuss findings or recommendations beyond the scope of the questions addressed by the work group. We don't have to develop the revised report text at this meeting, but if we can agree upon report changes, I'll ask members to send the revised text to the DFOs who worked on the report, and that's Tom Armitage and Brian Bloomer, after the meeting, or we can agree that I'll work with the DFOs to incorporate changes after the meeting. So I'd now like to ask Dr. Bond to provide a brief summary of the draft report. So Dr. Bond, the floor is yours.
Oh, Dr. Jones, before you begin that,
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say one thing before you begin. I was informed that part of my statement this morning about ethics issues was cut off from the public webcast. So I just want to reiterate that 3 SAB members have recused themselves from the discussion, from the deliberation on this report, due to avoid potential conflicts of interest. And those members are Marjorie Alion, Steve Hamburg, and Mark Le Chevalier. So sorry for the interruption. I just wanted to repeat that for the record. Thank you.
No, that was an important introduction, important interruption. Thank you for reiterating that. Dr. Bond, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, and thank you, everyone. And I'd like to give a brief summary of the highlights of the report that we put together. And following that, I would like to allow the people who worked on that report as well, who are present in this meeting, to provide any additional comments that they might want to add. And I'd like to begin, if it's all right, with briefly addressing the audience beyond the scientists that are assembled here, because I know that you are out there. Although no members of the public chose to provide comment at this meeting, I know that there's a lot of interest due to the number of public comments that were submitted on the docket. So next slide, please. Right, so it's impossible to imagine our nation without the benefits of electrical generation, which is the subject of this rule. It's electricity's versatility and reliability are an essential part of our quality of life. And electrical generation is as much a part of our landscape as purple mountains majesties and amber waves of grain. So I just wanted to begin by saying thank you to the people who have made this possible, the power plant owners, operators, investors, line workers, people who set tariffs, people who set prices, everybody involved. I'm sure I missed many classes of people. Thank you. I also wanted to acknowledge that we as a nation and a world are facing some pretty novel challenges. We've been engaging in behavior that is the emission of greenhouse gases that we know is likely to lead to serious consequences within the next generation. We're confident of some of those changes. We're less confident of others. One of the things that we do know is that we're driving too fast. And you know, when you drive too fast, there are risks that you know about, there are risks that you don't know about. And so in addition to the need to retain reliability of the electrical generation system, we do have concerns about the reliability of the environment and our climate. And I also wanted to say thank you to all the people who commented from a personal perspective of impact and concern about the direction of the future world for their children. So the nature of this challenge is that we know we need to make a course correction. And we are doing so in a landscape that is changing rapidly. Potential technical solutions are on the table. And some of those involve major changes in investment, infrastructure, and workforce. And they're in various stages of development. That's the way it is right now. Innovation responds to need. Some of the innovations are going to work. Some are not going to work. We will be surprised by successes and failures. And this feeling of tension that we are not quite ready to meet the challenge is a pretty common feature of this kind of situation. So where we are right now is that EPA needs to give guidance so that everyone can have their eye on the ball. Finally, I wanted to say that this is a team problem for everyone from the electrical generation operators, innovators, finance, public, and federal agencies, including but beyond EPA, especially the Department of Energy, have important roles to play here. And EPA's role is to identify the measures that will protect human health and the environment to the best of its ability. That's the spirit in which this committee reviewed the rule. Yeah, so I have not addressed the charge questions in order in the report to follow, but I touch on all of them. I've tried to group the major findings into three major headings. So next slide, please. And again, I'm speaking to people perhaps beyond scientists, and so I've attempted to make it a little bit simple. The expected temperature increase is related to cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, not to emissions that occur this year, the emissions that have occurred since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So some of the goals that people are seeking to achieve are not to go over 1.5 degrees C, and certainly not over 2 degrees C in terms of temperature increase. And these can be pretty well matched with totals of carbon dioxide that have been emitted. And so I've put a couple of little arrows on this diagram, the amount emitted before 2019, and then the amount emitted before 2022. And you can see that it's the beaker is not filling up very fast, but it is filling. And that means that the longer we wait to implement reductions, and the longer we delay measures, the higher the beaker has been filled. And so that is the first thing that I'd like to bring forward. Next slide, please. This proposed rule does embark on the path toward limiting greenhouse gas emissions, but it doesn't achieve the timely reductions needed to achieve environmental goals. So what we call the carbon budget, or the amount of CO2 that has been emitted since pre-industrial times, allowable to achieve temperatures that we would like to stay within, that budget is almost completely used up. Now, most modeling agrees that even though the measures that people have to think about for the electric generation sector may seem intimidating, that sector is one of the most accessible for decarbonization compared to other types of technology that also emit greenhouse gases. Technology is available at comparatively low cost. But in the rule that was put forward, there are substantial emissions in that sector remaining, even in 2040, and especially from natural gas combustion. So that's one thing that our subcommittee was quite concerned about, that yes, we're moving in the right direction, but these are not consistent with the administration's goals of continuing to emit natural gas. And I do want to note that it's not within the Scientific Advisory Board's scope to revisit the models. These are modeled emissions produced by EPA and submitted with the rule. So I think that's the first thing to note is, yes, we're doing things, but it isn't enough to match the administration goals of decarbonizing the electricity generation sector by 2035. There's still substantial emissions after that. Okay, so next slide. Emissions occur all along the value chain. So once you commit to burning something or using something at the point of generation, you're really committing to the emissions that occur all along the way. Both production and transportation have emissions, and these have been addressed in prior reports by the SAB, especially the production. What people find is that there are higher emissions from production of natural gas than expected, and that there have been reporting rules introduced to account for that. But if one is going to continue burning natural gas or using natural gas to create hydrogen for burning in power plants, then one has to account for those upstream emissions. That entire value chain is sometimes called well to wheels, because the power generation is not really wheels as mobile sources are. We decided to call it value chain emissions. Next, please. So the committee really emphasizes that you need value chain analysis. The atmosphere responds to all emissions. It does not care if emissions occur at the power plant or if they are occurring in the field of production. So again, methane emissions at production have been greater than expected. One of the elements of the rule is co-firing hydrogen, beginning with a little bit of co-firing as a possibility for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And transitioning to pretty high rates of co-firing, 95% by 2038. Hydrogen is a carrier of energy. It is not a source of energy. There are no hydrogen fields lying around. Hydrogen is currently generated with carbon-based fuels. There are other ways to do it, but what we don't know well, because hydrogen is not a huge part of the energy system right now, is what the impacts of hydrogen generation are going to be and what will happen during its transmission. EPA suggested in the rule that a definition of low greenhouse gas hydrogen that is compliant with current tax codes, including this definition and revisiting it as we understand more about hydrogen, is really required in order to ensure that we're not increasing greenhouse gas emissions instead of decreasing them if hydrogen is used. Next, please. So then the last point I'm going to make, one of our charge questions, is commenting on whether the proposed rule is, and its analysis of costs and benefits is adequately modeled. And there we have a few questions about that, but I just want to point out this is a really complex issue. It's not possible to do a full analysis for a single rule. And so we are seeing that EPA is taking on different reports and diving into different topics so that those investigations can underpin analysis confidently. So one of the things that EPA did was develop an energy modeling framework with an input-output model connected with plant-level response to regulations. EPA has put forward rules on recognizing upstream emissions in oil and gas. The SAB recently conducted a review of the health impact calculation model, BENMAP. There has been a working group to put forward the social cost of carbon and continue to identify the environmental and health impacts and their costs. And finally, as mentioned earlier in this meeting, there's an environmental justice self-study. So the Scientific Advisory Board really supports the integration of these different pieces, and yet we recognize that the number of moving parts required to keep the analysis current and including the best available science during a time of rapid change will continue to need additional capabilities. And so while we supported the framework that was used for the modeling of costs and benefits, we also identified some things that need to change or be updated as these different pieces come into play and are put forward. With regard to environmental justice, that's also been mentioned previously, we did identify a number of things that could improve. We think that the analysis done in this report was better and more comprehensive than in prior rules, but we did identify a few things that self-study group might wish to consider as they go forward, because they're going to be underpinning rules in the future. So I think those are the main points. I did not address each charge question, but those are the main findings that need to be considered. And I'd like to invite my colleagues who contributed to this report who are here, Drew Schindel, Susan Annenberg, Jay Chakrabarty, David Kaiser, and John Salmon, I believe, are the ones who are present. Is there anything that you all would like to add or bring forward?
I guess at the risk of repetition, thanks, Dr. Bond. I think you did a great job of summarizing our conclusions. And the only thing I would say at this stage is to reinforce the point that this gets us on the road that we want to be on a bit more than we are now. But if you look at the carbon budget issue that Dr. Bond elaborated on, the remaining carbon budget for our entire humanity is on the order of about 5 years at current rates. For the 1.5 limit, we're very, very close. And so getting down to zero is really kind of where we need to be headed, especially in advanced countries, because we've already essentially used up more than our share if you count historical emissions. And the rule, as we heard, moves us in the right direction. But for example, it lowers our projected emissions from these electricity generating units by around 7% in 2035 to 40 period, when obviously what we need to reach zero is 100%, right? So there's a very big gap between those. And while we're getting understandable pressure and commentary from those who have to deal with the transition, that it affects people's jobs, it affects industry's profits, it affects operators' ability to provide reliable service at least cost, right? All of these things are true, and yet on the other hand, not meeting the goals or how well we meet our goals for the keeping within the carbon budget affects everyone alive as well as those to come. So I just wanted to echo that, make that rationale clear for why we spend a lot of time on the carbon budget in the report, even though that wasn't necessarily one of the goals of asking us to look at this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bond, Dr. Schindel. Anybody else on the committee like to comment first? I'll just pause for a second in case you're trying to unmute. All right, hearing none, I would like to thank you for such an excellent, this excellent presentation. And Dr. Bond and Dr. Schindel, you also alluded to this, but I do appreciate your committee, calling out the public interest in this and just how important this is that you speak to not just the scientists who are thinking about this, but this affects everyone. So I do appreciate you, the way you presented this today. But I'd now like to ask if there are any comments from the board on this report. The board or board liaisons, I will say, on the draft report. Please raise your hand and we can hear your comments. All right, Dominique. Oh, you are muted.
Apology. Yeah, I wanted to second the fact that the report puts this in the broader context of the remaining carbon budget to stay within 1.5 or 2 degrees C. So that I think that was excellent. On the total emissions, on the value chain emissions, in principle, the EPA SAGE model should be able to pick that up. And traditionally, these models only pick up emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels. So that will probably be automatically be taken into account both in production and in transportation. But there's nothing that would prevent them from adding emissions from leakage as well. If those, and I know they can be very important. So it'd be interesting to ask those who are working with the SAGE model whether they are taking into account those additional sources of emissions in the entire value chain.
Thank you for that comment. Any other comments or questions? All right, I do not see any hands at this time. Okay, so.
Yeah, I addressed the last comment.
Yes, please.
Yes, so I agree that a life cycle model should address upstream emissions. I think one of the challenges that we face, both with regard to methane and hydrogen, is the lack of knowledge about those upstream emissions. So the oil and gas reporting rule that recently came through this committee did begin to propose some accounting for the emissions that are being found to be higher than previously expected, and has to do with not being able to predict from a bottom-up perspective. Hydrogen is so new and not yet a part of the really embedded in the energy system. And so the effects of leakage are really not well known. So we just acknowledge that certainly a life cycle model could account for those emissions if it had the information. Where we are right now is that they don't. And as we gain that information, there need to be ways of acknowledging that and rolling them into that accounting.
Thank you, Dr. Bond. Any other comments, questions? All right, well, then we can now, our next step is to, again, thank you for the report. I thought it was very comprehensive. Now I would like to request a motion regarding disposition of this report, so we can approve the report, approve with any revisions, or disapprove of the draft report. So I would like to entertain a motion from the board, and I would ask that if there's a motion, if someone could second it.
I'll motion to approve the report.
I'll second the motion. Thank you, Drs. Weintraub and Thorne. There's been a motion that is seconded to approve the report. Any discussion? All right, hearing none. All in favor of the motion to approve, please respond by saying yes.
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 Thank you. Any opposed, please respond by saying nay. Are there any abstentions? Okay, motion passed, another unanimous motion. So we will approve the report. Thank you so much to Dr. Bond and the rest of the panel for this report. So we appreciate it. So we will finalize the report and transmit it to the EPA administrator. I'd now like to move to the next agenda item, which is a discussion where we discuss recommendations received from the SAB work group for the review of science supporting EPA decisions. So first, I want to briefly review the process we follow for determining whether the SAB conducts reviews of the adequacy of the scientific and technical basis of planned EPA regulatory actions. So the Environmental Research Development and Demonstration Authorization Act of 1978, or ERDA, requires the EPA to make available to the SAB proposed criteria, documents, standards, limitations, or regulations provided to any other federal agency for formal review and comment, together with the relevant scientific and technical information on which the proposed actions are based. The SAB may then make available to the administrator within a time specified by the administrator its advice and any comments on the adequacy of the scientific and technical basis of the proposed actions. So to fulfill these requirements, the EPA and SAB follow a process that includes the following elements. One, the EPA submits to the SAB staff office information regarding planned actions in the agency's semi-annual regulatory agenda they're expected to undergo interagency review. The EPA transmits to the SAB staff office all proposed actions that are sent to the Office of Management and Budget for interagency review, as well as the relevant supporting scientific and technical information. The SAB work group for the review of science supporting EPA decisions holds monthly meetings to examine planned actions sent to the SAB office, receive information about planned actions from the agency, and identify aspects, if any, of the planned actions that may warrant review by the full SAB. The work group then prepares a memorandum to the full SAB with recommendations for or against peer review for each planned action. Then the chartered SAB holds public meetings to decide whether to undertake SAB peer reviews recommended by the work group. The SAB Science Supporting Decisions Work Group consists of myself, Dr. Kimberly Jones, David Allen, Barbara Beck, Veronica Berrocal, Jay Chakraborty, Stephen Hamburg, Celine Hernandez Ruiz, Sheila Olmsted, Jonathan Samet, Peter Thorne, Godfrey Uzuchukwu, and June Waintrap. The work group met on December 4th, 2023 and January 25th, 2024 to discuss the adequacy of the scientific and technical basis supporting planned EPA regulatory actions. The work group developed recommendations concerning SAB review of 8 EPA planned regulatory actions. These planned actions are listed and discussed in a February 2nd, 2024 memorandum from the work group to the full SAB. This memo is posted on the SAB website in the materials for this meeting. So as indicated in that memo, the work group found that no further SAB review of these 8 planned actions is warranted. I now ask the board to decide whether it agrees with the work group's recommendations. So first, before we discuss these recommendations, I want to pause and ask the board members if they have any questions about the process. You can raise your electronic hand, please, if you have any questions. Okay, so hearing no questions, I'll now just briefly introduce each of these actions that were voted on. The first is standards of performance for new stationary sources and emission guidelines for existing sources, large municipal waste combustors, voluntary remand response, and 5-year review. And it's RIN 2060-A018. So the work group found that this planned action does not warrant further review by the chartered SAB because EPA has neither developed nor relied upon new science for this rulemaking effort. The purpose of this action is to review the standards of performance for new stationary sources and emission guidelines for existing sources for large municipal waste combustors promulgated under the Clean Air Act. The new source performance standards and emission guidelines establish emission limitations based on maximum achievable control technology for controlling emissions of hazardous air pollutants and criteria pollutants from large municipal waste combustors. So I'd now like to call for a motion and any discussion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation on this action. I ask for a motion.
This is Joe, so moved.
Thank you, Joe.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor of the recommendation that to not move this forward for further discussion, please respond by saying aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Thank you so much. Motion passed. The second rule, the second plan action to be discussed is titled New Source Performance Standards for Greenhouse Gas Emissions from New, Modified, and Reconstructed Fossil Fuel-Fired Electric Generating Units, Emission Guidelines for Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Existing Fossil Fuel-Fired Electric Generating Units, and repeal of the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. It's already being reviewed by the SAB, and we discussed this today, but we already decided to, so no action. We did discuss this a bit, but we don't need any action on this today. I don't think there's any discussion or action needed because we've already decided to review it. So unless there are no questions or comments, I will move to our next action. Okay. The third plan action to be discussed is titled Supplemental Air Plan Actions, Interstate Transport of Air Pollution for the 2015 8-hour Ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standards and Supplemental Federal Good Neighbor Plan Requirements for the 2015 8-hour Ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standards, RIN 2060-AW09. The work group found this plan action does not warrant further review by the SAB. This proposed rulemaking addresses state implementation plan or SIP obligations for certain states under the Clean Air Act with respect to the 2015 ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standard. Where EPA has not approved a transport SIP or has made a finding of failure to submit, the EPA has an obligation to issue a federal implementation plan. So this rule proposes actions for several states. The technical products supporting the proposal are based on air quality, meteorological, and emissions models that have been widely used by the EPA for environmental assessments. The EPA has indicated that these models have already undergone peer review. So I'd like to call for a motion and any necessary discussion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation that this proposed action does not warrant further review by the SAB. Like to
I make a motion?
Yes, please do.
Seconded.
All right. It's been moved and seconded. Thank you both. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed? Please say nay. Any abstentions? Thank you. The fourth planned action is titled National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, Lime Manufacturing Plants Amendments, RIN 2060-AV59. The SAB work group found that this planned action does not warrant further review of the supporting science by the chartered SAB because no scientific work products are involved in this rulemaking. This action addresses the national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants, NESHAP, for lime manufacturing plants promulgated under the Clean Air Act. The EPA collected data from the exhaust stacks of lime kilns during its 2020 Residual Risk and Technology Review, RTR, for these sources and found 4 unregulated pollutants: hydrogen chloride, mercury, organic hazardous air pollutants, or HAPs, and dioxin furans. The agency is now proposing standards that reflect the maximum available control technology for these 4 pollutants for this source category. No new scientific work products are involved in this rulemaking. So I'd like to call for a motion and any discussion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation that this action does not warrant further review by the SAB.
I move to approve the recommendation.
Thank you, Dr. Thorne. Did I hear a second?
Second.
All right, thank you. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Excellent. All right, we're almost there. The fifth planned action to be discussed is titled Methane Emissions and Waste Reduction Incentive Program for Petroleum and Natural Gas Systems, RIN 2060-AW02. This proposal addresses calculation methodologies for determining a charge for excess methane emissions from applicable facilities that report to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, Petroleum and Natural Gas System Source category. The SAB work group found that this planned action does not warrant further review by the chartered SAB because the EPA has not developed new scientific or technical work products for this rulemaking. In addition, the SAB has already submitted a report to EPA assessing whether the agency's proposed methods for methane emissions reporting using empirical data are accurate and consistent with current scientific understanding of methane emissions. So I'd like to call for a motion and any necessary discussion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation that this action does not warrant further review by the SAB.
This is Joe, so moved.
Thank you, Joe.
A second?
All right, thank you, Florence. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, please respond by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, motion passed. Thank you. The sixth planned action is titled N-methylpyrrolidone Regulation under the Toxic Substance Control Act, or TSCA, RIN 2070-AK85. The EPA is proposing a rule to address the unreasonable risk of injury to human health presented by NMP under its conditions of use. The SAB work group found that this planned action does not warrant review by the chartered SAB because the supporting science has already been reviewed by the TSCA Science Advisory Committee on Chemicals. So I'd like to call for the motion and any necessary discussion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation on this action that it does not warrant further review by the SAB.
I move to approve.
Thank you, John.
Second.
All right. Thank you, Mary. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Excellent. Couple more to go. The seventh planned action to be discussed is Title I, bromopropane regulation under the Toxic Substance Control Act, or TSCA, RIN 2070-AK73. So the EPA is proposing a rule to address the unreasonable risk of injury to human health presented by 1, bromopropane without consideration of cost or other non-risk factors. The SAB work group found that this planned action does not warrant review by the chartered SAB because the supporting science has already been reviewed by TSCA Science Advisory Committee on Chemicals. So now I'd like to call for a motion and any necessary discussion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation that this action does not warrant additional review by the SAB.
I move to approve the recommendation, Ms. Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
Second.
Second, thank you, Earl. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right. The eighth planned action to be discussed is titled Clean Water Act Effluent Limitations Guidelines and Standards for the Meat and Poultry Products Point Source Category, RIN 2040-AG22. EPA is proposing to revise the effluent limitations guidelines and standards for the meat and poultry products point source category under the Clean Water Act to establish more stringent wastewater discharge standards for facilities directly discharging wastewater to surface waters, as well as pretreatment standards for facilities discharging wastewater to public-owned treatment works. EPA is taking this action because the agency identified this point source category as discharging some of the highest nutrient levels of all industrial categories in a cross-industry review of nutrient discharges, and because advanced nutrient treatment technologies are affordable and available. The SAB work group found that this planned action does not warrant further review by the chartered SAB because EPA has not relied upon new science for this rulemaking effort. I'd now like to call for a motion and any necessary discussion to approve or disprove the work group's recommendation that this planned action does not warrant further review by the chartered SAB.
I move to approve the motion.
Thank you, Marjorie.
Second.
There's a second. Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, they all pass. I want to thank you all for your attention and engagement to review those. I just want to pause and see if there are any comments from anyone on a work group or anyone else. Dr. Cobb, do you have a question?
Yeah, real quick, I'd just like to thank the SAB for approving those two reports that the SACC reviewed, the 1-bromopropane and the N-methylpyrrolidone. Also, in the review process, one thing came up that I think at least should be mentioned here at the SAB is that these are two newer chemicals that were that were designed as safer alternatives to some of the chlorinated solvents, and they were deemed still to be of adverse outcomes. And the committee was somewhat concerned that the legacy chemicals might slip through the system because there's not sufficient data that meets current detection limits and those kinds of things. So you end up with big holes in those assessments. It turns out that's not been the case to date, but I thought I should at least mention that there are some chemicals that have very little data that might be slipping through this process, whereas the chemicals with sufficient data might be held to a higher account. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the EPA's decision. I agree. I simply wanted to point that out.
Your point is well taken, Dr. Cobbin. Thank you for that comment. Are there any other comments or discussion items? Well, thank you. So we've now have time on the agenda to hear any brief clarifying comments from EPA and members of the public. And I would also like to ask the DFO, Tom Armitage, whether there have been any requests to speak at this time. If we have received requests, we'll allow the speakers time to make brief comments.
No, we have not received any requests for clarifying comments.
All right, thank you. And I also just take a minute to ask if there are any comments from EPA or any of the EPA staff on the call. All right, seeing no electronic hands, hearing no voices, I would now like to move to closing remarks. We are very early. We've made up some time today. So I do want to just thank members of the Chartered SAB for your participation in this very, very productive and efficient meeting. I do want to review the follow-up items and next steps. So on our first item, the quality review of the SAB draft report, review of the clean air status and trends, ambient air monitoring network or CASNet. I will work with Dr. Uzuchukwu and the panel to move the report forward in accordance with the decisions made and the comments and feedback we heard at the meeting, as well as those provided in writing. The other actions, the SAB report on a greenhouse gas power plant rule was accepted. So thank you for that. Thank you to both panels for their excellent work there. And the board agreed with the committee's recommendations on plan regulatory actions. And so I would like to pause at this time and ask if there are any additional questions from the board members. Okay. All right, so if there are no further questions, I will now turn this over to the DFO, Tom Armitage, to adjourn our meeting. Oh, wait, before we do that, I do want, because this is my last time to speak probably, I do want to always, I know I say this every time, but always just publicly thank the EPA staff for all of your work in preparing us, and me in particular, for these public meetings. Your work is, I don't know how we would get through this without all the work you all are doing in the background to pull together this information, and to make sure we have all the materials we need to do all this work. So I do want to, I know Tom Brennan mentioned this in the beginning and he thanked the staff, but I also want to publicly thank you all for all the work you've done to make sure we're prepared and can do our work on the SAB. So thank you. And now I'll turn it over to you, Tom.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I just want to also thank everyone for your time today. And I don't think there's anything else we need to talk about. So with that, I will adjourn the meeting. Thanks very much.